called the Christ Universal Temple Ensemble. Help me say thank you again. I just need to do one housekeeping thing before I introduce our dynamic speaker today. I asked Ms. Thelma Reed to move from she was just about in the last row over here, and I asked her to come and sit in the first row if she would, and she really didn't want to, but she's so gracious and so wonderful. But Thelma Reed has been a part of Christ Universal Temple for 63 years. October 1956. We love you, we bless you, we thank you. She still serves today. Help me say thank you, Christ Universal Temple, to Mrs. Thelma Reed. Thank you. Don Jackson is kind of my OG. He's going to steal my thunder. Now on to the business. Marianne Williamson is a best-selling author, lecturer, and nonprofit activist. She has worked with thousands of individuals, as well as large and small groups, in transforming crisis into opportunity. For 35 years, she has been helping people heal their problems. She has an up-close and personal understanding of the impact of bad policy on average Americans' lives. For 3 decades, Marianne has been a leader in spiritual and religiously progressive circles. Her book about the intersection of spirituality and politics, Healing the Soul of America, was released in 1997 and re-released in a revised edition in 2018. Her book, A Politics of Love, was released in April 2019. In total, she has written 13 books, 4 reaching #1 on the New York Times bestsellers list. Marianne has founded nonprofit organizations such as Project Angel Food. In 1989, Project Angel Food started delivering meals to homebound AIDS patients. The organization has now served over 12 million meals. She has also worked throughout her career on poverty, anti-hunger, and racial reconciliation issues. In 2014, she co-founded the Peace Alliance and supports the creation of a U.S. Department of Peace. See, when you don't have to complain about the darkness if you'll let a light shine. Is that right? In addition, she advocates a cabinet-level department of children and youth to more adequately address the chronic trauma of millions of American children. Whether you saw her on Oprah Winfrey or not, she is indeed a super soul. She once wrote these words: "Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, and fabulous? Actually, who are we not to be?" She wrote, "You are a child of God. Your playing small does not serve the world. There is nothing enlightening about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We were born to make manifest the glory of God. Christ Universal Temple, I'm happy to present to you Mrs. Marianne Williamson.
Thank you so much. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you, Reverend Wells. Thank you to the magnificent musicians. Thank you to all of you. What an honor it is to have the opportunity to speak into your listening today. I once did a spiritual retreat that was headed by a Catholic sister, Catholic nun, and at the end of the retreat, she said something I found so profound. She said, "I'd like to thank all of you who shared, both those of you who shared verbally and those of you who shared silently." It's so obvious in a room such as this when we come together with the deepest joining, the joining of our love, of our hearts, of our faith in something higher than ourselves. It's such a palpable sensation that all of us are contributing, all of us are participating. And that field of consciousness grows stronger because we are sharing. This is so particularly important today. People joined in love. And we know why it's so particularly important. It's important because some people are joined in hate. You know, we all come to a place like this. Universal Christ Temple holds the space, Reverend Wells, all the ministers here, for us to celebrate that God is good. For us to celebrate that in God all is harmony and all is peace. And it is the weariness and the pain of our souls that we have to experience the juxtaposition between the fact that we believe that, we know that, and we stand on that, and yet several miles from here, children live in chronic trauma. In this country, 13 million hungry children, 100,000 homeless children, children who go to schools where there aren't even the adequate school supplies with which to teach a child to read, knowing that if that child can't learn to read by the age of 8, that child has a drastically diminished opportunity to finish high school and a drastically increased chance of incarceration. Knowing that in some places in the world where if a woman such as myself, with the things that I say, particularly campaigning for president, particularly as a political candidate criticizing my government the way I do, how aware I am as a woman that there are countries in this world today where if I said a fraction of what I say, I would be hauled off to prison, probably tortured, and possibly worse. How do we live with that juxtaposition within our hearts of knowing that on one hand, God is so good, and on the other hand, such unnecessary suffering occurs each and every hour of each and every day? I heard somebody say recently that because I came from a religious and spiritual background, I just didn't understand that there's evil in the world. I laughed at that, given that our crowd is the one that names it. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that it is the spiritual and religious thematic that actually clues us in. It is the code written into all the great religious and spiritual traditions, which both explains to us the light and explains to us the darkness, and most importantly, explains to us what our part is in bringing forth the lightness when the darkness has come upon us. We all know we want to celebrate resurrection. We all know we want to celebrate the fact that the Israelites landed ultimately in the Promised Land. But we should not forget that before the resurrection, there was the crucifixion. We should not forget that before the Israelites were in the Promised Land, they had to take a journey out of the suffering of slavery in Egypt. If you just skip right to the resurrection and don't mention the crucifixion, you're not in transcendence, you're in denial. If you just move right to the Promised Land and forget the suffering that preceded it, you're not in transcendence, you are in denial. There's nothing sophisticated about that. There's something sophisticated about recognizing that as much as God is omnipotent, As much as God is all love, as much as love is all good, there is a force of consciousness. I don't believe in a devil. New Thought certainly doesn't believe in a devil that's out there stalking the planet, seeking for men's souls. I remember years ago saying to myself, oh, Marianne, you don't have to worry about anything like that. That's all in your head. And then I stopped for a second and thought, that's not really good news. The fact that it's in my head is like the worst place it could possibly be. And that's where it is. And it's important that we realize, isn't it, that to some extent it is in all of us. Because all of us were born into a world where from a very early age we were taught confusion. From a very early age we're taught the lie that we're separate. From a very early age we're taught that we're bodies and bodies only. From a very early age we're taught that other people are dangerous. From a very early age we're taught that we're all on our own here. From a very early age, we're taught that the world itself is a dangerous place to be, so we better constantly be in attack mode, we better constantly be in defense mode. And so we walk around too often as these isolated creatures in pain. And we try to mask our pain. We try to suppress our pain. And it's time in everyone's life, this time comes. And I believe it's time for the United States of America to look at where all that pain comes from. To get real about all that pain, to get real about our part in keeping that pain alive, to get real about the crucifixions and the slavery of consciousness that come upon nations, and to recognize the part that all of us have as individuals and as citizens in opening our hearts and making our lives available so that we might be the conduits for the resurrection. Otherwise, that symbolic 3 days can become 3 centuries. Otherwise, that 40 years in the desert can become 400 years. That 3 days means, yes, there's a crucifixion. Yes, there are forces that would invalidate love. Yes, there are forces that would destroy love. Yes, there are forces that would enslave. Yes, there are forces that would destroy. Yes, there are forces that hate. Yes, there are forces that would counter love at every turn. But God's will always prevails. God's will shall always be done. Love will always have the final word. That we can celebrate. We can celebrate the fact that love will always have the final word. However, it is incumbent upon us to be very clear how long that takes is up to us. It's not God's work that 12,000 children on this planet starve every day. It's not God's work that 1 billion people on this planet live in such deep poverty that it amounts to $1.25 and less a day. It's not God's work that there is such racial and criminal injustice in this country. It's not God's work that 93 million people live in either poverty or near poverty in this country. It's not God's work that 1% of all Americans own more wealth than the bottom 90%. It's not God's work that we have elementary school children on suicide watch. It's not God's work, the state of our planet in such peril if we do not take drastic action. It is not God's work that we spend so many billions and billions and billions of dollars on ways to prepare for war and so little in comparison on ways to wage peace. That was not God's work. That was man's work. And it is time we think about this, change our thinking, and change our ways. Now, in the Christian cross, as well as in the Jewish Star of David, there is a symbolic representation of the intersection between the horizontal plane of the earth and the vertical plane of our relationship with the divine. The point of wearing a Jewish Star of David or a Christian cross over your heart is to say, may I be the intersection. May I be where the two meet. May I be a space in which it is done on earth as it is in heaven. Heaven is the consciousness, the awareness of our oneness. But the point is to live our lives fully grounded on this earth, but to think the thoughts of heaven, that in us they might be as one. It's not enough to say, here's my life on earth, here's my life in heaven, and there are these two separate domains. No. And in a city like Chicago, boy, isn't it all a microcosm of this country? Because if you're making it in America, what a fine place to live. And if you're not quite making it in America, there's so much pain, so much unnecessary suffering. And the question for each and every one of us is, what is my part in bringing about that change? What is my part? God sends his teachers. God sends his people. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai, his message was, I shall make of you a priestly people. And what does it mean that God will make of us a priestly people? It means that if you're a teacher who holds the space for the highest level of consciousness that is possible within that profession. If you are a scientist, you're holding the space for the highest level of consciousness within that profession. If you are a business person, you are holding the space for the highest level of consciousness within that profession. If you are a mother, if you are a father, if you are a lover, if you are a friend, if you are a citizen, if you are an artist, if you are a healer, that you stand within that space so aligned with the vertical, so aligned with the highest level of consciousness within that profession, that all the ways of the horizontal, all the ways of the earth become purified. And that which is not aligned with that highest level of consciousness, which is love, begins to fall. And all that is potential for that highest state of consciousness begins to rise. Now, we all know, ladies and gentlemen, in this country and in this world, in every field of endeavor, we see so much low energy. We see so much hate. We see so much injustice. We see so much that is not what we know in our hearts that this country or this world should be. But the real problem is not the darkness. The issue is for us to always remember that darkness isn't a thing. Darkness is just the absence of the light. And fear is not a thing, it's just the absence of love. The issue is not the presence of the darkness, the issue is the absence of the light. And the absence of the light is each and every one of us when we stand upon that rock. We stand upon that rock and we see certain things and we understand what denial is. There's positive denial and there's negative denial. Negative denial is when you see such things and it's just too painful, it's too traumatic, it's too inconvenient, so you look away. That is not God's work. You are not carrying the torch of God if you're only carrying it into light-filled rooms. The whole point of carrying the torch of God is to be willing to move into the darkened caverns of our own minds and the darkest caverns of the world. That is God's work. And when we do that, we do practice denial, but it's a different kind of denial. We don't look away from darkness. We don't look away from suffering. We don't look away from injustice. We don't look away from greed. We don't look away from domination. We don't look away from oppression. We look at all those things. We look them straight in the eye, and we deny their power over us. Because you see, all those things would scare us. And all those things would say to us, you and your children don't have a chance. I'm going to get you. I'm going to get you in your body. I'm going to get you in your soul. I'm going to get you on your streets. I'm going to get you in your government. I'm going to get you on your planet. And we tremble and we fear. But only until we remember who we are. And once we remember who we are, we look right back and we say, let me tell you something. Until I knew who lived in me, you scared me. Until I realized that there is a power in me for which you are nothing, you scared me. And so I trembled because everywhere I looked, it was like you were looking at me and saying, you leave. But I remember who I am now. I remember the power of God in me. And also, if I'm an American or a member, a citizen of any free society, I remember the power vested in me, not only by the love of God, but the power of the U.S. Constitution. And so, therefore, I have something to say to you. You leave. I see it in my own life. I see it in so many places. I've seen it throughout my life. I really see it now. So many voices. You leave. You leave. You have no right to be here. You know, it's an amazing thing when you know I'm an American woman, I'm a daughter of God, and I'm staying. Because there are so many voices that would make up stories about how you're not quite good enough. You're not quite good enough. You're not quite good enough. And so it weakens us. It debilitates us. And when we are weakened, then we don't know how to share our strength. When we feel disabled, we don't know how to share our abilities. But the problem is not the threats. The problem is that we have forgotten who we are. And so when we declare that God is good, it is so important that we remember it's not just that God is good, it's that God is good in us. God is good in us. And the issue isn't, dear God, how can you let children starve? The issue is God saying to us, how do you let children starve? The issue isn't, oh, dear God, why all these wars, why all these wars, why all these wars? The issue is God saying to us, last time they started one, I don't remember you saying anything. The issue is all of the ways in which we must now awaken. The Course in Miracles says that a mass awakening, it says, well, first of all, it says that in the Bible it says that Adam fell asleep, and nowhere does it say that he woke up. The Course in Miracles says that there has been no mass awakening, but that this is the time in which the mass awakening begins. What does it mean to be spiritually asleep? What it means to be spiritually asleep is to realize, is to think that all the flesh and bone, that's all that's going on here. What it means to be spiritually awake is to know that something so much more is going on. To know that the universe itself is intentional. You know, in the Jewish book of wisdom, the Talmud, it says that over every blade of grass, there is an angel bent over whispering, grow, grow, grow. In every acorn, there is the architecture for the giant oak tree. In every bud, there is the architecture for the giant blossom. In every embryo, there is the architecture for the baby. And in each and every one of us, there is the architecture by which we might become the highest creative manifestation of who we are. Now, the difference between the acorn and you and me is that the acorn can't say, no, I don't want to. You and I say, nah, all the time. That's what free will means. Free will means you can say yes to nature, you can say yes to love, you can say yes to all the unlimited potential. It is not humble, it is arrogant to deny the infinite potential within yourself. Because it must be arrogant, because if there's not infinite potential within you, then God must not have made you, because God is the infinite potential of love. So for you to say yes to that is humble. For you to say, yes, use me, is humble. And then to know that it's not what you're going to do, it's just that he can use your hands, and he can use your feet, and he can use your brain, and he can use your heart, and he can use the words that you speak. Because otherwise, God remains over here, and the suffering of the world remains over here, and the whole point is, may they intersect in me. Use me. And then when you go into your classroom, you're there a little bit more than a teacher, you're here as a priestess of love. And then when you go into your business, you're there as more than a business person, you're there as a priest of love. When you do any business or any project, any writing, any healing, you're a doctor, you're a nurse, you're an administrator, anything you do, anything we do in any moment, are you there just as flesh and bones, hoping that this might be an okay experience? Or do you remember who you are and you remember why you're here? Because we are children of God, which is the same thing as saying we are thoughts in the mind of God, which is the same thing as saying we are made of the stuff. The only difference between us and God is God made us, we didn't make him. But when God thinks a thought, he extends of himself. So all of the endless, infinite creativity of God, all of the potential of God is within each and every one of us. And our divine architecture is stuff that there is nothing. You know, in the Course in Miracles, it says that those who have achieved the most on this earth have achieved a fraction of what each and every one of us are capable of. None of us have even made a dent in what we're capable of. And so in our national life and in our global experience and in our personal lives, we're taught to look at what is and go, do you like it? Because you made it up. This is what you decided on. And you can change your mind. Anything can change out there as long as it changes in here. Because what's out there is just a reflection of what's in here. What's out there is just the symptom. What's in here is the cause. What's out there is just the effect. What's in here is the cause. All those suffering children, well, you didn't help them, did you? All those hungry people, didn't quite feed them, did you? All those wars, you didn't quite wage peace, did you? So many areas where, oh, we just don't know how it happened. And in our own lives, when we transform, none of us transform without looking in the mirror. None of us transform without telling some brutal truths to ourselves. None of us transform without being willing to see what was my part in this disaster. And so now we're living at a time in our own country, in our own nation, where we are faced with challenges that are collective in nature. So many people are now awakening to the fact that I don't care what the public issue is, it'll make it to your private door. Good luck with all that green juice and gluten-free and stuff. Because there's so many contaminants in the water, there's so many carcinogens in the food, so many toxins in the air. Why? Because we've got to make sure that chemical companies, food companies, oil and gas companies, agribusiness makes its money first. Health insurance companies make their money first. Health insurance companies, big pharmaceutical companies, then make their money first. Banks make their money first. Gun manufacturers make their money first. Oil and big gun manufacturers, defense contractors make their money first. Nuclear industry makes its money first. So is the real problem the fact that the American government is now instituted in such a way and is constituted in such a way and acts in such a way that for all intents and purposes, it's not a government of the people, by the people, and for the people right now. It's a government of, by, and for those huge multinational corporate interests I just mentioned. Our government is a government of a few of the people, by a few of the people, and for a few of the people. But is the real problem that that's the case? Or is the real problem that we all let it get this bad? Is the real problem that that's the case? Or is the real problem that we are even thinking of allowing that to continue? You know, I read a book called The Invention of Wings. Invention of Wings by Sue Monk Kidd. It was a very meaningful book to me. It's about these two women called the Grimke sisters who actually lived. They were born into a slave-owning family in Charleston, South Carolina. And they were converted to the abolitionist cause by the Quakers, and then they became leading abolitionists and feminists. And what the book was, the insight that I got from it was the process, the psychological and emotional and moral and spiritual journey that someone would take, and there were many, who were born into slave-owning families and then realized where they were, and realized what their family was about, and realized what their city was about. I remember I was at a slum in Kenya, and I was watching a young man. It's one of the biggest slums in the world called Kibera. And I was wondering, I was looking at this young man. He was looking down at this creek, but really the creek is just sewage. And I was looking at these children, and I was looking at these teenagers, and I was wondering, I wonder at what age they really realize where they are. And so reading this book, Invention of Wings, made me think about the difference between being anti-slavery and being an abolitionist. And there were many people who were anti-slavery, and many people, they lived in places like Massachusetts, and they didn't live in slave-owning states. And they would say terrible things about slavery, and they would say that slavery was horrible and sinful, and they couldn't imagine how people could be slave owners, and they would never do it. But that sentiment, however noble, would not have moved the needle for one enslaved person. But some people crossed the bridge. They crossed that psychological and emotional and moral bridge. They crossed that bridge from, I don't agree with it, to, oh, not on my watch. That's the abolition. And it's not an accident that the abolitionist movement arose from the early evangelicals and Quakers. Any more than it's an accident that so many of the leaders of the women's suffragette movement were Quakers. Any more than it's an accident that the civil rights movement was led by a Baptist preacher and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It has always been throughout our history, out of religious and spiritual circles, that people's movements have arisen by which groups of people said, enough is enough. When enough people stand upon the rock, and let me tell you what happens when you stand on the rock, that God is good. When you stand on the rock that says not only is God good, but you are on this earth to be the conduit for God's goodness. Not only is everything possible in love, but that doesn't matter if your mind and your hands and your feet aren't expressing that love. What happens when you stand on that rock that says, you know that all people are created equal thing? We mean that. You know, God gave all men inalienable rights of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. I stand on that rock. I mean that. You know that part in the Declaration of Independence where it says that governments are instituted to secure those rights? You stand on the rock and you say, we mean that. And where it also says that if the government is not doing its job to secure those rights, that the people have the power to alter it or abolish it. You stand on the rock and say, oh, we mean that too. And when we do stand on the rock, it gives us the power that the mortal mind alone does not have. It's an energy, it's an inspiration, it's a motivation, it's a capability to own these two words in a way that you just don't own them until you stand on that rock. One word is no, and one word is oh yes. Well, that was two words, but yes. And the no is this: I see it, and I'm not okay with it. I see it, I will not look away from it, but you stop right there. You stop right there. You know, as a woman, I feel this so strongly, because do you know that in every advanced mammalian species that survives and thrives, a common anthropological characteristic is the fierce behavior of the adult female when she senses there is a threat to her cubs. The mama bear, the mama tiger. Like you go to states like Montana, let's say, and they'll tell you if you're going to go out into the wilderness, the black bears, they'll leave you alone. You leave them alone unless you get anywhere near their babies. They're coming after you. Something's wrong with the women of this species that we are not registering. They're coming after the babies. The babies aren't okay. And that is the difference between I don't agree with that and not okay with it, as in not on my watch. That was the difference between anti-slavery and abolitionists. What has happened to our generation, ladies and gentlemen? We're not dealing with anything the abolitionists weren't dealing with. We're not dealing with anything that the suffragettes weren't dealing with. We're not dealing with anything that the civil rights workers weren't dealing with, except some lack of courage that they displayed. What do you call economic injustice? What do you call rape of the planet? What do you call mass incarceration? What do you call racial disparity in criminal sentencing? What do you call an endless war machine that is at the expense of genuine trying for peace? What do you call the complete erosion of our democracy, turning it into a corporatocracy? What do you call that except just a national crucifixion? It's all what these symbols mean. It's what fear would do. It's what lovelessness would do. And we must stand on the rock of knowing that we have been not only given the rights of this extraordinary possibility, just the possibility that we could create a society in which all people could soar, all people could spread their wings, all people could unleash their spirits, all people could uncap their dreams. We've never fully lived it or manifested it, obviously. Those principles were written into a document. The 56 men who signed that document, the Declaration of Independence, they themselves, 41 of them were slave owners. So that dichotomy has always been with us. That dichotomy, that bipolarity is part of the characterological makeup of our country. But every generation writes its chapter in this ongoing story. Every generation has displayed both sides of the American character, ours no less than any other. That we aspire to the most enlightened principles of human possibility that have ever been inscribed in the founding of a nation, and the fact that we have from the beginning also had forces that would mitigate against and even transgress in the most violent ways against those principles. And now it's our turn. Now it's our turn to realize that in our time, in our era, with us present, America is both. Every generation decides, what chapter will you write? And we not only have to identify our problems, let us identify with the problem solvers in our past. And remember how many of them stood on the rock of faith, how many of them stood on the rock of commitment, how many of them proclaimed that where there was injustice, on their watch there would now be justice. Where there was fear, on their watch there would now be love. There was lack of mercy, but on their watch there would now be mercy. On their watch there were some terrible, terrible forms of oppression, but on their watch there would be freedom. On their watch, there were attacks and assaults on democracy, but on their watch, there would now be a new birth of freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, we have everything we need. The people who have stood up in former times, they weren't perfect people any more than we are perfect people, but they had within them, as we have within us, that which is perfect, and that which, in the presence of which all things are possible. They stood there on that rock. And they said no to what needed to be said no to, and they said yes to those things as yet unseen. That's the power of the yes that faith gives you. Obviously, the abolitionists could not yet see a world without slavery, but they knew it was possible. The suffragettes could not see a world without the suppression of women, but they knew it was possible. The civil rights workers could not see a world without segregation, but they knew it was possible, and they said yes to that which was possible. And they became conduits of the journey to the promised land. They became conduits for the resurrection. As they say, God, use me. Use my hands, use my feet, use my mind, use my mouth, use my tongue, use my hands. Do with me what you would want me to do, and send me where you would want me to go, and have me say what you would want me to say. Because I know that there are other people who think like I think, and there are other people who feel like I do, and there are other people who are feeling, I think we're supposed to say yes, I think we're supposed to say yes. So many millions of people who go, I really think we're supposed to say no to that, I really think we're supposed to say yes to that. And we will do in our time what people have done for thousands and thousands of years. Whenever things have gotten too dark and too terrible, however late the hour, there have always been people who've stood up and they have said, I will stand on the rock of mercy, and I will stand on the rock of justice, and I will stand on the rock of love. And in my time, before I die, I will see those things now come to pass. God bless you. Thank you.